G'day everyone. I've had to move some furniture. I realised I should have had Cyprus in a different spot. We are seeing some movement today. So Paul has been stuck in Caesarea in this area. So this is Jerusalem, Caesarea a bit north of where Jerusalem is. He's been stuck in Caesarea for the last couple of chapters. He's been on trial before Felix, he's been on trial before Festus, he's been on trial before the Sanhedrin, a little bit before that. He's been on the trial before Agrippa. He's explained himself to Agrippa, but he's appealed to Caesar. And so Agrippa and Festus have gone, well, man, we just released him, but he's appealed to Caesar, so he's got to go to Rome. So he gets put on a ship and they sail for Rome. That's the fastest way to go, is by boat. Obviously, rather than going through land, it's a lot more dangerous, actually, because there's more bandits and stuff. And, it takes a lot of soldiers to protect a whole group of prisoners. So you chuck them on a ship, you sail them over much easier. That's still not completely safe. There's obviously storms and stuff, but they leave Caesarea and they skirt around Cyprus. So this is Cyprus. They skirt around Cyprus and they kind of come around and they get to Crete. I don't have a table for Crete, but just imagine Crete is just here. So Crete's here and they hang out in Crete for a little bit because of wind and stuff. And Paul's like, we should stay here because the weather is not going well. And so they go, no, we don't want to be on this bit of Crete. We want to be just around the side where there's a port that's suitable for our boat to winter in. And so what they get a gentle breeze. They go, this is our chance. So they're kind of anchored in Crete for a little bit. And they think, this is our chance. We can go. So they set sail again. And on the way over to the kind of this port that faces two directions, which is really handy if you're a boat, because you kind of protect yourself from kind of the waves and you can kind of exit however you want. They're on their way there, but a huge hurricane comes up, a huge storm, and it blows them completely off course. And it lasts for a long time, long enough that sailors who would have experienced storms before, who would know what storms are all about, who would understand what it's like to be in a storm, has all of these things kind of happen where they go, hang on, we've got to make sure that things are off. We've got to get rid of this, we've got to get rid of that, we've got to cut the lifeboats going. In fact, the Paul says to the soldiers at one stage that you've got to cut the lifeboats away because if the sailors leave, we all die. We need the sailors. So they cut the lifeboats, so the sailors have to stay on the boat. They kind of go, they're chucking out food, none of them are eating because they're in constant turmoil and constant stress. It's all going hard, it's all going terribly, it's all mayhem. And then Paul says to them, he stands up and he says to them, you should have listened to me, for one, but you need to run the boat aground. So I'm going to read a little bit out of it. So it's chapter 27, so verse 21. So this is kind of the key point. They're in the middle of the storm. They've just taken a battering. They're nowhere near where they wanted to be. They wanted to port in Crete. That's not what's happened. They've been blown way off course. And so Paul says this. After they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Man, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" So he tells them this, and what happens is they kind of get the point that they're close to land. So the way they used to do, it's called soundings, the way they used to do that was they had have a rope, and they'd tie knots in it a long way. So be a really, 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 really long rope, and they'd tie knots at kind of regular intervals. And so they'd drop that rope down, and they'd keep on going until they felt it hit the floor. Because you would feel it hit the floor, you would feel that kind of tug and jolt or whatever, and then they'd pull it up and they'd go, okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so a 10, and then they do it again, and then they pull it up and they go, okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, shallower. Do it again. Okay, now we're at 8, shallower. Do it again. Now we're at 6, shallower. Do it again. Now we're at 5, shallower. That's how they took sounding. So they know they're getting closer to land. They know that land is kind of coming up, and they run the ship aground. They steer it into land, which if in the middle of the storm where you've had to throw out your food and your tackle and no lifeboats and all the rest, like your ship is being destroyed, you just got to get to land. That's the thing that's going to be safe. You kind of give up on keeping the ship going, you just get to land. And so that's what they do, and they get to land. They end up on Malta. We find out it's Malta. and they get to land, and they land there, and the soldiers are concerned. It's like, man, if we run aground, the prisoners all will escape. And so they're about to kill them all, and the centurion stops them because he wants to spare Paul's life, because obviously Paul's been speaking with him, he likes Paul. Paul's just saved their life, told them what he should be doing. So he wants to save Paul's life, which saves everyone else's, and so they all get to shore. In this kind of bit, Paul is bitten on the hand by a snake. They're warming themselves by a fire, and all the locals are there, and the locals of Malta treat them with kindness, we see. They build a fire for them and bring them food, and Paul is bitten by a snake, and he shakes it off, and all the locals think he's going to die. And they wait around for a bit, and then he doesn't die. And so they think he's pretty amazing. He then goes to the governor's house. Again, obviously, why wouldn't you take the bloke who's just been bitten by a snake but hasn't died? This impressive. Take him to the governor's house where he heals some people, and so people all around Malta come and get healed. Now, Paul is there for 3 months. He's there for 3 months. And you can assume that he'd be preaching and sharing the gospel. So kind of map-wise, so if this is kind of Jerusalem, Judea area, and then north of that, so Cyprus, north of that, kind of going around, kind of Crete would be like here-ish, say in this area, and then Malta, I might walk off camera, so I'll try not to go too far. Malta's like out here, right? And so that's where he's ended up, and then Rome's a bit further out, so we might need to do something with camera angles next week. But, so that's the kind of the trip. He's a long, long way away from where he is now. He's ended up on Malta, and he's there for 3 months. And while he's there, he's healed some people and probably recovering a bit from the shipwreck and all the rest of it. But he's at Malta and he's sharing there. And I want us to talk about this because Paul is shipwrecked. Again, this is not a pleasant thing to go through. Someone who's doing what God's wanted to do. He was in Caesarea and he knew that God wanted him in Rome. And he appeals to Caesar. And so they send him off to Rome. And on the way, we would expect, surely if that's what God wants you to do, it would be smooth sailing, wouldn't it? If God wants you in Rome, why wouldn't that just be all smooth? But it's not, because that's just not what God's plan was. And God protected Paul all through this. But he still ends up shipwrecked and in Malta, not Rome. Now, we might look at this and go, so we can just claim that God will have our back, because even though Paul is in danger, he's not killed. But Paul is still in danger. He's still in prison. He still has hard things going on. And Paul not being killed is because that's what God had revealed to him. Because remember, as we went through Acts, we were way back here when it was just kind of Jerusalem and we were all piled in. We saw kind of Peter and James both put in prison, but James is executed while Peter is freed by God. We don't know why James died and Peter didn't. So Paul doesn't die. God has a plan for Paul to get to Rome, and that's very clear, and Paul doesn't die. But it's not this wild thing that nothing's going to happen to anyone just because I hope so. It's because God had revealed it to him. If God has told us we need to do something, then we need to do it. It is important that we need to do it. God had told Paul to get to Rome. Now, it wasn't a cruisy trip at all. It's storms and danger and all the rest of it. But in that, there's all those sailors and all those prisoners and all those soldiers who, while they're at Crete, they leave, they get to Crete, and Paul says, hey, we should stay here, guys, because, God's told me that we should stay here. And they go, no, we're going to push on. They push on and they hit a storm and it blows them around. And then Paul stands up and says, God has told me that none of you are going to die, because God told him none were going to die. So Paul passes that information on. And the sailors and the soldiers and the prisoners all would have thought they were going to die. This guy says God's told him we're not. They crash on shore, which he says they need to do. They're treated kindly by the people in Malta. They're taken to the governor's place for 3 months. Surely all of those people there have seen that and gone, hey, there's got to be something about this God. There's got to be something about what Paul is like. Maybe we should listen to this guy. God has told us things. We need to listen to what God has told us. We know about Jesus. We've got the Bible that tells us about Jesus. We can show what God has said. We can show by how we live, how we behave, our character, by living out our faith. If God has told you anything, then you need to act on that. For me, one of the ways that kind of Dad always kind of sorted things out. If there's two good options, they both look right. He always told me that he would pray and say for someone to call him who wasn't crazy, so it was never like the president to call me or the prime minister to call me or the queen to call me. It was have somebody from wherever call me and say this, if this is what you want me to do, or if not, then this. That was always the thing, something reasonable that could happen, but still not something Dad could control, that kind of thing. Now for me, I just want to share with you just briefly how God told me something and so I needed to do it. When I was in I would have been year 12, I think, maybe first year out of high school, I started leading on Christian camps in winter and summer called ESA. So Equip, Serve and Assist is what it stands for. It initially started in Marysville until the fires, and then we were in Anglesea for winter and Phillip Island for summer, or the other way around. I think that was the right way around. And so that's where we did our camps. When I was 20, Dad died just before winter camp, just before. Now, I had gone to the meetings. I'd always planned on going to winter camp. Dad was going through chemo and had gone into palliative care, but we were told there'd be months. Now, that week, so it would have been leaving on the Friday, I think, to go, and Dad died on the Tuesday. Now, for me, I had a choice. And they're both, sounds weird, but they're both good choices. Stay with my family and be there with having Dad just died, and serve there and do good there, be holy and righteous by doing that. It is good to support family and love family. Or go in a Christian camp where I could witness to kids about Jesus and share Jesus with them. Also good and right. Two good things. And so I prayed that if God wanted me to go on ESA still, that someone would call and say, hey, are you going to ESA? Simple as that, right? Now, that's what I was praying because I was torn. I didn't know what to do and I needed God's direction. Now, I got a phone call. So Dad died at 7 o'clock. I got a phone call at 7:30 from a mate of mine who called up, and he didn't know Dad had died. No one knew, and he just called up and say, hey, Mike, how are you going? I was just wondering, are you planning on coming to ESA camp still? That's all he said. Now, for me, that was God saying that's where I was needing to go. Now, I still came back for Dad's funeral, so I had that day then and stayed at home that night and then went back to camp. But God had told me what I needed to do very clearly. We need to listen, and that's how it's worked for me and for Dad, and that's a really helpful way to do it because God does answer our prayers, but for you it might be something different. But if you or I, as followers of Jesus, if God's told us what we need to do, then we need to do it. Just like Paul, have the faith to go and do what God has told us to do, to get to Rome. No matter the storm, no matter how hard things are and how difficult, it wasn't an easy decision to make. I don't think my family were necessarily thrilled with my decision either. I think they understood, but it's a hard decision. It wasn't an easy decision to make at all, but it was the one that I knew God had for me. Now, there's other times in my life where I've followed what God has had in store for me. I just wanted to use that example because it's a really clear one in my life of two good things that God has directed me towards. Different churches as well. Calling is another one. That's another story. I'm happy to share that with you if you want. But for you, if there's a time, if you can think of a time where God has called you to something, you've done it, and you've seen, even though it's been tough, how God has worked it out at the end, that's worth holding on to because it works for Paul. God had a plan for Paul and Paul stuck to it. So as we finish up this week, I want you to think about times and how we can listen better to what God would have us do. Have a great week.